Brilliant. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this beautiful sunny day. We've got Al Coates with us today, who we know quite well, works not far from us, but lives miles away. Al, you're a social worker, many other hats. So tell us about how you got into social work and what's kind of your specialism.
Specialism. I got into. I'm a slightly reluctant social worker in that I came to it late in life. I qualified 7 years ago, like now. But prior to that, I kind of jokingly say I was a fully functioning adult. I worked in construction for 20 plus years. I worked. My daughter's coming. This is my BBC moment. I'm live to the nation, and you're messing around. Go on, sling your hook. It's a proper BBC moment. It's a good job you didn't run in and get me in a headlock. So I was a structural draftsman, and that's all I ever wanted to do. I wanted to draw things, and I did that for years. But I'd always through different organisations, I'd had sort of fingers in different pies, working into different communities. You know, I'd done some work with the homeless when I was young. I'd done some work in schools. I'd done lots of different things. And then my wife and I guess that my story involves kind of this journey into adoption. And when we got married, and my wife's 10 years older than me, so she said, "Oh, we need to think about children." I was 27. I said, "Oh, we got time." She went, "Not really." I went, "Oh, that was a bit of a shock." We got married quickly. We got engaged and married in 6 weeks. That's another story. And then long story short is we decided to adopt, and we really felt that was something that we wanted to do, but we didn't want to kind of mess around and have to go through the process. Like, we wanted a big family, so if you adopt one child, you have to then start again and go through the process again. So we said, let's just cut to the chase and let's take sibling groups, knowing that sibling groups are really hard to find homes for. So we then we adopted a sibling group of 3, which just like that, there was a long story, for a story, but then we adopted a sibling group. And actually, that was really good. I was a bit freaked out. I was 27, dad of 3 overnight, and in fact, incredibly freaked out. I had no idea what I was doing, even though I'd spent years convincing people I knew what I was doing so I could get through the process. And there was a few wobbly years, and getting used to being in that new life, and supporting our children who were great kids, really lovely children. Adoption is what it is, and it's children who've experienced a whole range of adversities, including adoption. If you want to be blunt, adoption in of itself is a trauma. And then we went on to foster, and because my wife said, "Oh, we're bored, the kids are better at school, we've got a very low boredom threshold in my family," and she said, let's foster. So we became foster carers, just like that. That's another story. They initially deferred us because they said, "Oh, you two, you'll just want to keep the babies," and we went, "No, that's a crazy idea. We're not going to keep the babies." And then, actually, long story short, they gave us babies. A really complicated story. That took several years and court cases, and ultimately we were asked to adopt the children, the two children we'd fostered, and they'd come to us as babies, and we kind of very cautiously said yes, and my older children said, "No, we're going to do that. It's great." And then our life kind of totally unraveled, and we just became conscious that caring for children who've experienced trauma is really complex. And when you talk about trauma, you'll know the statistics. When you look at the NSPCC statistics, trauma's not out there somewhere else. Trauma's really close. Trauma's the kid next door. When we talk about complicated separations and divorces, 1 in 5 children experience domestic violence. 1 in 28 children experience the death of a parent. 1 in 20 sexual abuse. 1 in 14 experience physical abuse. And so we see that trauma's out there. And I think that when we caring for children who've experienced trauma, you see that plays out. In a textbook on a classroom, people say this is the impact of trauma, and you go, "Oh, that's I get that." It's kids who are fizzy, kids who are not able to concentrate, kids who struggle to form attachments, children who really clearly see the world. The impact of trauma alters how children see themselves. It alters how they see the world and how it sees people in it. And then trying to then care and parent for children like that can be really complex, and it can be really counterintuitive. So again, long story short, there's a story, and there's a long, big, thick book in all of this. But I couldn't continue to work. The needs of my children were such that I sat down with my wife one day and she was unraveling and I was unraveling and we were all unraveling. And I said, I can't do this anymore. The advice I was getting from social workers was just, if I'm being generous, was not very good. And if I'm being honest, it was dire. And so I went home and I bought lots of big books and I sat down and we just worked a way out of how to care for children who were manifesting the impact of real traumatic experiences. And as that went on, I saw there was a bursary to become a social worker and I didn't really want to be one. And I thought, oh, that's not an insignificant amount of money. And I looked at what, I hadn't been to university. I'd done day release, working class northern lad who'd gone to day release and done construction. And they said, oh, it's a full-time course. And I looked at full-time and it was like 18 hours a week. And I thought, blimey, that's from Pitt, that's a day's work, that is. That's a gross stereotype. And I just thought it worked. That I could still maintain an awful lot of my parenting presence and qualify. So ultimately, again, what then happened was my wife, we maintained really positive links into the family of my children who'd been fostered, some of the family members who were kind of really safe and really appropriate. And one day my wife bumped into her in the street, an aunt. And the aunt said, I'll never guess what, Mum's pregnant again. Do you want to have the baby? And my wife went, oh, yeah, of course, because that's how it works in my family. But we went through the process appropriately. We didn't just kind of barter this relationship. And then actually the day that I qualified, my youngest daughter, the one that just came in, moved in when she was 2 years old. So that's how I became a social worker. But then through that process, it became really clear that I did not want to work in adoption. Not really uncomfortable with some aspects of current adoption practice, really questioning the ethics of adoption, and felt that actually it was probably too close to home. And also, if you're Mr. and Mrs. we want to adopt, and I turn up at your front door and they get a sniff of the fact I've got 6 adopted children, they're going to go, oh, this guy's the wrong person for us, because I feel massively freaked out by his sort of experience and knowledge. So I kind of went into fostering, really, because that felt like a natural fit. And also that applied knowledge of how to care for children who've experienced trauma felt like it worked. And I'd obviously had that experience of being fostering, because I think fostering is a really complicated. Professionals consistently kind of can't get their heads around foster carers. So that's how I became a social worker. That was the longest intro. That's like 7.5 minutes of me going. It's also my story of how I got to be where I am. Sorry.
Really interesting. So in terms of, because it sounds like it was a really, really arduous process, and there was a lot of things that you felt you wanted to change. So what are you presently doing in this arena that, if I'm in a prospective adopter looking in, how can you persuade me that this is a good move? And
well, I guess, that's really interesting. You've never coached a question to me in that way. I would say, well, you tell me why you think it's a good move for you. I'd say convince me, because there's a couple of things there that I think historically we've always seen it as this kind of really magical solution to two problems, that we've got parents or adults who can't have children for whatever reason, and we've got children who haven't or can't be parented by their biological parents over here. And we've gone, oh, look, that's a fit. That's a perfect fit. And I think that world has altered. When you look at the late 60s, we were up to 27,000 adoptions a year. By the year 2000, that was down to 2,000 children. So there's a really common narrative around what there's really strong cultural narratives around adoption. So you don't have to go very far in the Disney catalog to find adoption. You look at all this idea of other parents caring for children. So you look at it's everywhere. I mean, it's Stuart Little. It's my mind's suddenly gone blank. You've got Annie. You've got almost every story. When you start to think about it, adoption is really well woven into our narrative. But also from a cultural, a European country, adoption is a big part of our faith narrative. So England is a historically Christian country. It's probably wouldn't couch itself in those terms now. But the language of faith is totally woven around adoption if you read the New Testament. And I think that's then coloured how people come to adoption. So if you were coming to me, Joe, saying, all right, I'm up for it, I'd say, well, what do you know about adoption? You might go, well, it's just these lovely little kids who need a dad, and I'm a dead canny dad. And I'd go, right, let's unpick that about why you want to do it and what you're expecting. And then ask questions about, can you support children in their relation to their identity? And that could be around ethnicity, it could be culture, where they come from, where they live, but also what about who their family members are? Are you willing to have that ongoing contact? Because it's a hugely contentious issue, and if you go to Europe, the continent, they would see that it's a human rights issue, that adoption contravenes children's human rights, that you sever them from their family, which is article, forgive me, I'm going to take a stab, 8 of the UN Convention on Human Rights, the right to a family life. Adoption severs that. And when we look at why children are adopted, it's the temptation is to think that it's all this really severe narrative of sexual, physical abuse, but it's predominantly failure to keep children safe. It's around neglect, which is no less significant. I'm not kind of giving you a hierarchy of abuse, but that often then reframes the parents, though, that the parents are not necessarily a danger. They don't present a physical present danger. However, they may not be able to care for their children. And so how do we do, so for that community who have their children removed for adoption, we're committing, I think Justice McFarlane, who's the present head of the family court, said that adoption is probably the most penal act or judgment that can be made. Now that the death penalty is gone, if you at 19 you can't care for your child, people say, you can't look after your children. You've dropped the ball here. But at 19, you lose your child forever. I can't imagine any worse. I'm not going to say punishment, but it might feel like a punishment, if you're that person. And then though that person's left high and dry without any contact, their parental rights are severed, and they've got no link. But that child as well, there's a severance there that is in of itself traumatic. And I know the work you do, but that often love is a really peculiar thing, that you can love, and you love the person who's not looking after you that well just as strong as the kid who loves the parent who is looking after them that well. Love doesn't work like that. And so this savior narrative that adopters, I'm not so glib or trite to say that adopters fall into that, but that's a narrative that hovers around. The amount of times that people have said to me, you've done an amazing thing. And I adopted 6 kids. The people go, they immediately canonize me and say, that's amazing. Those children are so lucky, you've done so well. And you go, well, actually, our life is really normal. It's enduringly normal. It's got its odd elements. So it's, in some ways, you want to debunk that myth, and also the myth that things will be different for us. We're not, yeah, but they'll be different for me. I could come to you and say, well, this is a child who's experienced a high level of adversity, and therefore they're going to maybe outwork that in a really complex dynamic in your home. And I can almost see people glazing over, going, well, it'll be different for me. Obviously, as an adoptive parent, you get access to resources that other parents don't get to. And that's a really complicated dynamic, to think that the money that, there's the Adoption Support Fund, which is fantastic and incredibly welcome. I'm being careful what I say in case, I get damned, but, it's incredibly welcome. But that money, what difference could that money have made to a mum and a dad who are struggling? Now, I think it's ifs and buts, and money doesn't work like that. We know that how the government allocates its money doesn't work like that. So I think there's an awful lot of complex politics and ethics around adoption. However, I do believe that there still remains a cohort of children who adoption is the best option, with a caveat to that adoption can be altered to make it even better for them, and that those links can be maintained.
On to what Mark has just asked.
Yeah.
So Mark has just said, agree about the problem adoption. Can there be a different way to help children without their biological parents?
There are different options. There's special guardianships, which there's a huge increase, and I don't think there's a formal or an official number of special guardianship arrangements, but I think we're running at about 200,000 children that we know of, and kinship arrangements. So those are children who are, they go to a big sister or or an auntie or an uncle or a granddad or grandmum or a combination of that. But what we see is those children who have experienced exactly the same as children who've adopted, but then get left with a family member, which is great. But those family members don't get access to the support that an adoptive parent would. And also on a really complex issue, and heaven forbid that it would ever happen to you, but if a social worker appears at your door, like I'm my age, I'm a granddad now, I'm very young for that. But 49, if a social worker appeared at my door with my granddaughter and said, this terrible situation's happened, we found your little granddaughter, and she's going to come into care tonight unless you look after her. There's not a grandparent or an auntie or an uncle in the world who wouldn't say, like, how's she going into care? Bring her here. Now, at that moment, you've then lost the opportunity to get access to resources, because if that child, even if they went into care overnight, next morning and they left care, they would be a previously looked after child. And that's a kind of a status that means you get access to public resources. And if you did the right thing and said, bring them in, you don't get that access. So things like the Adoption Support Fund is open to special guardians, only if the children have been previously looked after. So there's a huge kind of like, and that seems like because a box wasn't ticked on a form, the access to resources is hugely impacted by what it seems like just a bureaucratic nonsense. So there's all that complicated stuff. That's one way children can be looked after. I think permanent fostering is good. I think foster, this, I get really frustrated by the narrative of, children languishing in the foster care system, because that's just rubbish. Almost every foster care is doing everything they can for children. However, fostering is really difficult because it comes with all of the challenges of professionals, if I'm being brutally honest, traipsing through your door every 4 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 weeks. And you don't have any parental responsibility. You have some scope for what you can do. So it's a really complicated dynamic. And we know that long-term fostering isn't that long-term. It struggles to be long-term. It struggles to be, for a 3-year-old to 18. So adoption, I think the complexity of adoption is that there's a pragmatic trade-off that if you say to someone, you get parental responsibility, this child becomes yours. Language of ownership around children is really complicated. This child becomes yours. Then those parents, their drive and commitment is steps up into something different that you can't necessarily get in other ways. And that's not to downplay any specific individuals, and that in relation to fostering and stuff. But that's the evidence suggests that that you get that. That's the kind of the magic factor you get with adoption, but it comes at a trade-off, and that's where you have to be pragmatic. Are you prepared to that severance of those family ties? Is it worth it? And for some, and I'm not going to speak for adult adoptees at all, but some might say no, it's not, and some might say yes, it is. But that voice, the adopted adult voice, is really quiet, and again, that's a really complicated voice to hear, because when we look at, Finding My Family, is that the Nikki Campbell TV program, that's all historic stuff. That's years ago. That represents a totally different culture, a totally different system and a paradigm. It's the voices of the children now, but we know, you work with young people and children, and children's voices are really complicated because what they want now may not be what they want tomorrow. And in some ways, so there's a cohort of young adults now that kind of come through the care, the Children Act 1989, who have then been through that process. So they're the voices we really need to gather, and the voices of children and young people now, and hear what they want to say. I feel like I'm drawing you well into the long grass here. You've not even got a chance to answer questions. You have to butt in if you need to ask questions.
I've still got that stat in your head that you gave us a while ago about how it's dropped. Was it from 27,000 to 2,000?
Mm-hmm.
So is this because special guardianship is not counted in the figures? Have we hidden them somewhere else? Is the process too laborious? What's going on there?
Well, I mean, the figures, the 27,000 was like the high watermark of the post-war sort of repression. You still had the Abortion Act hadn't kicked in. It was still kind of socially unacceptable for single mums. Contraception was, the pill on a really basic level. Things like the pill had not managed. We're just at all of those three things then coincided to see then it kind of incrementally decreased right the way through to 2000. Now we've then gone at 2000 was a low watermark, and we got Tony Blair's government really boosted it, and it booped it up to about 3,500. And then the coalition, because Michael Gove is adopted, so he's quite clearly passionate about it. Edward Timpson, who was the children minister, he was a real fantastic champion for all children in the care system, because his story is that he grew up in a house that fostered, and one of his brothers is adopted. Was a real strong champion for this, and they boosted the figures up to 5,500 mid-teens. But then we're seeing a trail off, and they put a lot of money into boosting it up. And my hunch is that unless adoption transforms, it's in this terminal decline. And I'd rather live in a world where adoption wasn't needed, or we found better alternatives. Special guardianships were introduced in 2008. Or around that time, and we've seen a steady increase in special guardianship orders to the point now where they're on a par. You get about 3,500 special guardianships and adoption orders every year. But if you want to talk about, special guardianships are an incredibly vulnerable group of people, in that often you've got, paint a picture of a grandma who's looking after their grandson, but also she's dealing with the crap, if I can be frank, of the child who then had their child taken out of them. So they've got often the complex family dynamics of individuals propping up a whole family unit with a limited access to resources, and then being elderly. And that kind of leads into then complicated issues around the behavior of children, because we know that predominantly special guardians and adopters, not to such an extent, are older. And when you talk about older parents, then you talk about people who come with a different parenting paradigm. So, probably the parenting, we're all of a similar age. Joe's clearly much older, or he's had a harder life. Yeah, that's me. Cut the thing. But we probably came up through a paradigm of quite authoritarian parents. Our parents were very much, they used to jump. We said how high on the way up, or we got a slap. Culturally, growing up in the 70s and 80s, we didn't think anything of that. No one thought anything of that. That world is gone. So people who grew up in them, and that's the world I grew up in, I've moved with the times, and I totally understand why we don't do those things anymore. But if you're then if your child grew up, if you were a child of the 60s and 70s, your children have gone, and now you're then a grandparent who's parenting. Maybe the style of parenting you've got is from that paradigm. And then someone says you can't hit your children, and they go, "What?" It's this. You've left a void. They don't want to hit their children, but you need to give them an alternative. You need to teach them a new way of parenting that isn't just because they're thinking, "Oh, if I don't hit my children, I'm just turning into I might as well be wearing kaftans and beads and floating around because I've turned into a hippie permissive parent." And we're saying, "Well, that's not good either." So that often is the one area that's missing. And then add in the complexity of children who've experienced trauma and adversity. They're then children who would potentially need a very specific type of parenting, something like a therapeutic parenting. So honestly, I feel like I'm just talking your heads off.
No, it's good. It's good.
So I think that's the area that I kind of fell into, and from my own experience of children whose behavior is complex and they need special type of parenting. Yeah.
If you woke up tomorrow and you were given a magic wand to make the system more useful, doctors or people fostering, and to children, what would that look like?
Now, if I had that answer, I wouldn't be sat talking to you today, would I? I think you need to put money into the children's workforce. I think you need to put money into social care. I think you need to, if we're talking about magic ones, I'd say you need to stop us getting to that situation. I think you need a trauma-informed, ACE aware, adverse childhood experience aware workforce that's well resourced, that can support mums and dads, so that children, that they're not falling at that. And when they do fall into complicated situations or hard times or domestic violence, all that stuff, that there's adequate support to either pull people out of situations and get them safe. That's it's like that thing, if you stand pulling bodies out of the river, the question ultimately has to be, why are they falling in? And you need to go upstream. And that's, so you kind of look at systemic, look at poverty, you look at housing, you look at drugs and alcohol services, you look at early adversity, and then you're back to schools, how schools respond, how probation responds, how the police respond. So that's, that's a really good cop-out, because then I don't have to talk about how you fix the adoption system. But ultimately, then you would hope that you'd get to a place where there would be so few children. When you look at fostering, the majority of children who come into fostering then leave fostering. That often families fall into difficulties for a window, of time. And then when you look at children who are abused, that often it's this precipitation of circumstances. This not precipitation. This kind of this coming together of circumstances that mean that children and families fall into hard times, and that stress is worked out in really difficult ways. That's not universally true, but that's quite often the case. So how do we stop these pinch points and help families through these difficult circumstances, so that families are then, that parents are not kind of falling into drugs and alcohol misuse and, all kinds of stuff. But so you're trying to kind of help children back into their families appropriately. Unfortunately, there will always be a need for children who cannot live with their parents. That's the crux of it. So what do you do with them? Then I think you need to look at them really specifically. I think special guardianship for non-related guardians is a really interesting idea. You look at what other countries do, and I'm not a great expert. America's, forgive me, but America's kind of much more wedded to the idea of adoption, culturally, very much so, and foster care systems. But you look at Scandinavian countries, and I don't think we can say, that it's perfect because it's Scandinavian, but I think that they have a much more nuanced understanding of family connection. But I think that then you need to ask questions about how do you maintain links with children that can't live with their parents, and how do you do that in a way that is meaningful and beneficial? So that could be through contact, which at the moment is not mandatory. It's not even it has to be considered, but is very often the power dynamic lies with adopters. It's a buyer's market, if I can be really crude, and don't quote me on that. But on a real sense, there's fewer adopters than there are children waiting. So that creates an environment where adopters can be, or prospective adopters are, given what they want in relation to the process and system. That if they say, I don't think I could do contact, then you're left with a pragmatic decision. Do you leave a child in the care system, or do you leave them waiting to be adopted, or do you say, we can live with that? So I think that contact is probably as we look to the future, contact will be the key issue. Because it's heartbreaking, but I don't think that my magic wand is going to get what it wants. I think that adoption's here to stay, and I think that I get that. I don't have a problem with that, as long as we can promise that we're going to change it and make it better for everyone. The new government's come in, and they've clearly, I think that this time last year, if you'd asked me, I'd have said I feel that adoption's kind of waning, that the political agenda is falling away from it, where it's, every politician wants to be stood next to an adopter because it's good news, isn't it? That back to that narrative of it's a happy ever after. Look, I got more adopters in, hand around the adopter, happy ever after. But then this new government has come in and sort of very clearly said that adoption is back on the agenda, which I think is good news for adopters, and can be good news for children if we do it right. Oh, sorry, I do talk too much, don't I?
No.
I was just thinking, because when you were saying about because there are more children that need adopting than there are adopters, that sometimes if they're not happy with the arrangements to see their biological parent, it can fall down. Is that what you're kind of saying?
I'm not having. I couldn't give you a specific example of that, but that's
Yeah.
the question I'm asking is that power dynamic shifts towards the adopters getting what they want. For an example of that is at the beginning, 2012, 13, 14, that sort of time, adopters said there was a strong lobby to say that the process to adopt should be kind of have a mandatory timescale that should be 6 months unless there's a good reason not to. And so it was reduced to 6 months. Now, to become a foster carer, that mandatory timescale is 9 months. Now, you would have thought that would be the way around. That actually, if people are going to do this and we're going to give them children, we would want the bar to be higher, wouldn't we? We'd want to be able to take more time over that. But we need adopters. If you believe in adoption, then you need adopters. So then that swings the power dynamics toward adopters. I mean, adopters would probably argue this, if you got an adopter on, they'd say, oh, that's rubbish. My LA treats me like rubbish. I'd say, yeah, but try and be a birth mum and then you'll see what, it's relative. It's not great how adopters are treated, but it's relative to birth families. It's the red carpet.
I know that you do a lot of work with challenging families and child-to-parent abuse.
Yeah, and that's an interesting.
And I follow you on Twitter, and I see and I listen to your podcast. Talk us a little bit about your connection with child-to-parent abuse, or some people might call it violence.
Well, yeah, I mean that's the first point is what we're talking about, and I guess it's that behaviour that is outside of normal developmental behaviour, and we all accept that toddlers have tantrums, teenagers get stroppy, but it's behaviour that then flips beyond developmental norms. So we talk about aggression, and I think aggression is really interesting. When we talk about aggression, that can be, I can repeat every word you say and that's aggressive, or I can knock your teeth out and that's aggressive. So aggression is it's a tapering scale, isn't it, up to physical violence, but it can start with just refusing to move a cup, because you can do that in an aggressive way. The way you talk to someone can be aggressive. So violence is the very high end of that. So our experience as a family was that the impact of early adversity manifests itself as challenging behavior, and I found that there was just nothing out there and no one wanted to talk about it. I went to my social worker and I said, can you help us? And they went, well, it's just not you being over anxious. And I went, what? And then, so this was before I was a social worker, and I just thought, oh, stuff that for a game of cards, and just started to read books. But ultimately what it led to was I anecdotally knew that this was an issue for a lot of adoptive families, that people would talk to me, and you like any community, we all sit around and have a natter and go, oh, this is happening, that's happening, and that it seemed like it was outside of the norm for my other friends who weren't from this community, that actually this level of aggression and violence in very young children seemed way beyond the norm, and so I just on a whim one Sunday afternoon, I kind of put out a Survey Monkey questionnaire saying, hey, who's this having this? And so, 100 or so adopters got back to me. And that was really interesting because it painted a picture of, if you go to the literature, there's a huge prevalence around adolescent violent and aggressive behavior. If you Google it, there's the Home Office guidance that's around adolescent, and that's kind of and that's Home Office guidance. So it's kind of it's this complex, murky world between the law and age of criminal culpability and where we sit in all. But families were going, I don't care about any of that. It just, my 8-year-old's kicking me in the face. That's what I care about. I don't care about, don't call it what you want, but this is it. And so what me and my friend Dr. Wendy Thorley did, and we then did another survey. We got nearly 600 responses from not just we really foresaw that that this was well outside of the adoption community, that actually the common thread with all adopted children is they have experienced trauma to varying degrees, but there's that universality. So we stepped out into a whole range of different communities and saw that we got nearly 600 responses, and just started to see this picture of children who'd experienced adversity, children with special educational needs. Again, that's a risk factor, it's not a cause. And just saw that actually we also kind of started to dig around the impact on parents, and saw that there was an awful lot of parents who were really, really kind of ticking every box in relation to desperately struggling. So parents' mental health, parents' relationships. So that could be, romantic relationships, but also relationships with family members. Again, this conflict of how children should be behaved, this paradigm of older parents struggling with children, and then them not necessarily having the tools or the language to communicate that. Family members going, this is how you should deal with it, and them saying that's not how we should deal with it. So we just kind of really unpick this picture of actually this happening a lot, and there's huge debate around how prevalent is this. And you've talked to someone like Helen Bonnick, I know you know Helen, and she would say about 10%. When we talk about the adoption community, there was a survey last year from Adoption UK that talked about 65% of adoptive families at some point experiencing violent aggressive behaviour. Now, there's a cohort of about 80,000 adopted children in the UK under 18. That's a lot of kids. But then when we start to unpick it more, we look at the SEND, the special educational needs and disabilities community. We see a huge prevalence in that community, so overrepresented, and there's about 1.3 million children. So even if we're saying it's 5% of those children, my maths doesn't stretch to that, but it's a lot of kids. So that kind of got us really, what that meant for me is by then I was a kind of a relatively spring chicken of a social worker, but I would go into community teams and people, you'd say, who here knows about this phenomenon? They'd go, oh yeah, I've got a family that gets this, and I've got a family, but anyone here, have we not got something we can do for people? Oh no. So that led to me and Helen, doing a lot of stuff together, and I think probably the most profound experience for me was we were invited to speak at a community care conference, which is like a social work conference. So we were talking about this, challenging violent aggressive behaviour, and there's a room full of 250 plus people. And so the first question is, who here has worked with children who get violent aggressive sometimes? Every hand goes up. Of course it would. They've all come to that talk, not stupid. I said, who here has been trained on that? 4 hands went up. They go, right. So we're talking about, there's in a room of 200 plus people, 250 people, 4 people. So we're not even talking, we're not, but 1-2% of people. So I think very much, Helen and I feel very similar about this, but I sort of set myself about really kicking up a fuss about this and raising the profile of the issue. Because I think that it's all well and good going in and asking for services, but you've got to justify the service. And so just shouting loud every opportunity, getting Helen Bonnick on my podcast, writing articles for different organizations, just raising the profile and saying this is a thing. And we could argue the toss over why it's happening, but we need to get academics involved. So then you see people like Amanda Hall, who've been doing work for a long time, and Cottrell, and there's lots of research shows that there's lots of risk factors for it, but that doesn't help you if you're a mum who's getting punched. You need to know what to do about it. It's all well and good saying, oh, hey, read this academic paper. Gee, thanks. Is it going to stop? Is it going to protect my face? So really looking at services. So I think this is where it kind of ties really interestingly back to adoption, in that, see, adoptive families, I think, are really comfortable to come forward, or not really comfortable, but have a get out in that they can say, this isn't my child. This is the child you gave me. So they can then say, actually, they can sort of, in some ways, attribute the behavior to someone else. They can say, everything was fine, but this is a child who's experienced trauma and adversity, etc., etc. It's not my fault, but there's something going on. And I think one of the key issues around this behavior is often that parents, carers, feel incredibly blamed and are blamed, because that's our cultural paradigm that, if a kid's kicking off in Tesco's, we all look around and go, where's the parent? That's the first thing we do. And so if a child's behavior is inappropriate, then we go, where's the parent? Because this is the parent's responsibility. But for this cohort of children, that isn't always the case. That it's a much more nuanced conversation. So the adopters of kind of are in a unique position to push that forwards with kind of maybe being able to kind of cast off that shame. And so they've pushed it forward. And again, because I think adopters have the ear of professionals, they have the ear of politicians. Everyone's mildly interested in what adopters have to say because they're this commodity. That then it gets ratcheted up the agenda. And then on the back of that, I've been, people have quite clearly, then once the door's open, you can kick it through. So there's some really interesting interventions. I know you do a lot of work in, the family-based solutions, through, that solution-focused approach. And non-violent resistance, which is the which is really big in the adoption community, which is this. But again, it's very much a parenting coaching model, reflecting that you can't come in and just say, the narrative often, and I'm sure you've seen this, as a parent comes in and goes, Johnny, when he doesn't like when he can't get what he wants, Johnny kicks right off. Fix him, please. But let's, and nonviolent resistance is very much in a kind of a view of, actually, that might be the case, but actually the only person you can really change is yourself. So you need to look at yourself, and it's a non-blaming, but it's actually saying maybe what part of this are you? And sometimes children's behavior is really it is always complex, but actually it's saying, that the roots of it may not lie at your door, but the solution does. Yeah. That's the crux of it, and that's a really complicated dynamic too. So you need to build up a lot of trust with families, because they are used to being told it's their fault, and that ultimately led to us this year. Long story short, I'm like wheeled out to any available. I'll go to the opening of an envelope if I can talk about this issue. So I found myself at this conference for the police, and I kind of did my spiel. I've got a kind of a cunning way of drawing people in, then shocking them, and out of that came this opportunity to work with the police. So with Northumbria Police, they had a domestic homicide review where a mum had been killed by a 15-year-old. Which is a heartbreaking case and a traumatic case, but the failings of the system were laid out really well. Frequently, mum being sent on a parenting course, mum being told, actually, you're just a crap parent, for the crux of it. And that's me reducing, lots of words down to very simple. But Northumbria Police took it really seriously and said, actually, we want to do better. So can you help us do better? The first thing we're going to do is we're going to count it. And I think that the old adage, we measure what matters, and what matters is measured. So we worked with the police all of last year, and they asked us what to collate. So we collated issues around the age of the children, the kind of their family circumstances. Were they, who was the caller? Was the caller grandma? Was it mum? Was it dad? Was it sibling? Was there any special educational needs? What was the outcome? What was the age of the child? What was the sex of the child? A whole raft of things. And you can read that report, which is available. If you Google me, you'll find it. But it's the, I'm trying to think what it's called. But Google me, you'll find it. I'm on academia.edu. And if you go at academia.edu and look at all of our reports are on there. But fantastic, we saw that, fantastically interesting that we saw that the police were called out 500 plus times over a 10-month period. And there was some children who were repeated, but actually the police were often really, Northumbria Police are ahead of the game in that they've taken this very seriously. But their responses were really proportionate, very much led by the parents. Very few convictions, because again, that's an anxiety for a lot of families. If I ring the police, what's going to happen? But I was talking to a guy recently, I'd been talking to him, he's a friend of mine, and we'd been talking through what the work I was doing, and it started to kick off with his 14-year-old, and he said, I'm just ringing the police, because the police are not going to throw her in jail without, unless she gets a policeman in the headlock, she's not going to jail. But actually, this is out of my control, and this has become a very scary situation. And he had a younger child in the house, and he said, I've got to either choose, do I look after the younger child or do I look after the 14-year-old? Because I can subdue the 14-year-old, but it's going to be ugly. And, we don't want to get into that kind of narrative, that you can imagine that picture of trying to subdue a 14-year-old. He said, actually, I'm not even going there. Called the police. Police came, calmed the situation, referral into children's social care. My friend, before the referral got in, had emailed social care, because there was involvement anyway, and said, hey, this is what's happened. You're going to get a call in the morning, and I'll tell you the story. And this is what's happened, and this is what we're doing about it. So there's an element of, maybe, it's that adage of, if you tell the story first, you control the narrative. So telling families to, don't be frightened of children's social care, be wise, but actually they're there to help. Inform them of what's going on. Don't be kind of blown to and fro. And actually that changes the narrative in the home. If you're frightened of calling the police because you're frightened of social care, then in some ways that the power dynamics then become in favor of a child that then knows that you're not going to call the police. So if there's genuine danger and threat, call the police. If televisions have been thrown out of windows, call the police. Again, I've just talked, and I just go where my lips take me.
But that's fantastic. That work you're doing with the police force, because often what what we can find sometimes, if the police arrive and it's not dealt with in a useful way, like you said, it seemed to empower the young person even more, because, well, you've called the police, nothing's happened, now what you're going to do?
Yeah.
You know, so the work you're doing with them sounds brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, the police. So I was going to say the one thing I've always advised every family: you think if your trajectory is that sooner or later you're going to be calling the police, don't wait until you need to call the police. You go on go on Google. Your local police force will have an officer kind of dedicated to your community. Give them a ring. Send them an email saying, "Hey, this is my story. This is my social worker. This is my GP. This is my psychiatrist. This is my support worker. Corroborate my story, but will you please put a note on my address to say, if you get a call, it is serious. We're not time wasting, but be mindful my daughter's got ADHD, or my daughter's got a history of," and that changes the dynamic, because I've got a friend who's an police officer, and he said they will not go into a house without getting some information, even if they're walking up Garden Drive and they radio in and say, "Is anything on this address?" And they might, if it's enough to say, "Oh, the kid's got ADHD," the parents, that means it's a very different conversation. So, sorry, I butted across you there with my words.
No. So, has the work you've done with is it Northumbrian Police Force? Is that an ongoing thing?
On a basic level, they're going to keep collating the data, so we've got a year-on-year comparison. And I think obviously we're in strange days we're living in. One of the things that we found was that actually the levels of violence and aggression, the police call-outs, reduced during the summer holidays last year. So that no one's quite sure why. We can all hypothesize to that. Could it be that schools cause a great deal of stress? Could it be that children are out about creating trouble in bush shelters? So it could be, it could be a whole raft of things. But interesting to see what the impact of lockdown has had, because a lot of teenagers, and I think lockdown, I was having this conversation with my daughter, and she's, bless her, she's fantastic, she's lush, but she's at the worst possible moment to be in lockdown for a teenager, because this is the moment when she should be separating from us. Psychologically, teenagers need to separate. They need to cleave from their carers, their parents. It's totally appropriate. It's totally healthy for everyone to have this separation. I was listening to someone the other day, and they were laughing. They're saying the reason teenagers are awful is it makes it easy on parents. So when they go, so my daughter, she's trapped in this environment where she really wants to be with her friends, because that's who she needs to be with. And I said to her, look, I want you to be with your friends. I said, and you need to go, and then you'll come back in your 20s and we'll be friends again. And she was like, "Oh, is that a thing?" And I went, "That's an absolute thing. Please, but I'm really sorry that you're locked down in the house. Yeah, fly, be free, my pretty." So there's a lot that's caused an awful lot of tension for kids who really developmentally, they need to be out right now, and obviously they're doing that on social media, but for some kids that's not enough. They need to be kicking around the streets with their mates, but that can't happen. And so, I mean, it's maybe a bit more now, but so I think that's caused all kinds of stresses for families at the moment, that, my daughter really needs to, so we've started to really actively facilitate her relationships, where I'm I'm from that model of kids just, you're 14, get on with your life. And now I'm saying, right, how can I help you get on with your life? Do you need a lift? Do you need a lift to the bus stop? If I give you £1, will you stay out longer? That sort of thing. Bless her, she's cracking. I don't know where she is. She might run in and demand that I turn the Wi-Fi off or on or something. She's got these usual stresses and strains. Sorry, I'm talking again.
I'm just going to put up another question for you, and I think this goes both ways for children safe from adopted parents and adopted parents safe from their children. Interesting stories. This is from Mark, who doesn't live in the UK, by the way. I would like to ask who works in the UK if children would not be safe in adopted families, or is there a child abuse in adoption? Does family supervising come into it, or something similar?
Yeah, I mean, the same rules apply to any. I mean, in law, once the adoption order is done, you're the same as every other family. So that means that you become subject to the same child protection services, or it's not CPS, what do we call it here? Child safeguarding services or children and family services. I think
I'm looking at it changes month to month, doesn't it?
it does, yeah. They, just rebranding. Someone's making money. I think the complexity is that those children are children who've experienced trauma and adversity. That then asks more of the parents. It's got to ask more of the parents. So we're expecting them to cope. So we're asking a lot of adoptive parents as well, I think, that, and we're saying that, that they maybe came like Joe at the very beginning, I want to adopt. And they came with that narrative, that, that idea. And then all of a sudden, 2 or 3 years down the line, we've got a child whose behavior doesn't fit that ideal. And, I've just recently done a seminar, I'm going to release it on my podcast, about chronic loss, this chronic sadness, this idea that adopters who've gone through infertility themselves have then adopted, then this ideal that they had of their, we were going to run through the meadows, we were going to, I was going to throw you in the air and you're going to like it, and I was going to teach you to play football and it was going to be beautiful. And the kid goes, none of that, I'm going to be me. Or also, I'm not sure I like you, or I'm freaked out, or you've got, behavior that's complicated and reflects the levels of stress and anxiety in that child. And that adopter's then going, experiencing a genuine loss of that future, a loss of that dream. And a lot of adoptive families, that children don't stop being children when they get to 18, that complicated early adulthoods for children who've experienced trauma and loss, how they work that out and how they, it's just complicated. So I think that then we do see, then it comes as a real shock for adopters when actually the social worker goes, you did what? How did you do that? And then this lovely, this service that brought them in with biscuits and cups of tea then turns into the social worker with the jackboots that kicks your door in and goes, what the funk is going on here? And again, we say, anecdotally, I know lots of families that have found themselves on the wrong side of children's services. And I think children's services struggle with us because, one, the dynamic, I'm a social worker. I think the paradigm is that if you're a social worker, you're working with vulnerable people. You walk into my house, can you imagine coming in my house and being my social worker? How's that going to go down? That's complicated. You're my post-adoption support worker, and I probably know the law better than you. And I probably have got more adoption experience than you. And, once I got, my social worker knows that it's been an issue for us, challenging violent aggressive behavior. And I got this email saying, there's this course coming up in the Northeast. I think it'd be really beneficial for you to go on it. And I looked at it and I went, yeah, I'm delivering it. And she went, oh, that's complicated then, isn't it? I went, yeah, but I'll make notes and I'll send them to you.
Yeah.
That sounds a bit arrogant, but what it means is that's not atypical, that when you look at the cohort of adopted parents, that they're generally a bit better off. They're usually university educated, not universally, but they're people who've got their lives together. And so then as a social worker going into that environment, they're people who are connected. They've got friends. They know how to complain. They know how to kick up a fuss. That all messes with these social workers' heads, who's used to kind of a dynamic of perhaps going into a different sort of home and talking to a different sort of parent. They go into an adoptive parent, and the adoptive parent goes, hey, an adoptive parent rightly is sometimes going, you ain't doing that in here. I know the law. Then starting conflicts because the paradigm is totally reversed. Whether I know how to write a really good complaint letter, and I will if you mess up. I'm a practice educator for social workers. I've sat in meetings and thought, I know which of your professional capability standards you're missing right now, and I'm going to write a letter and I'm going to list them out verbatim from the regulations and from the, that creates a really cocked up dynamic for adoptive parents. I don't know how we got onto that.
Basically, don't mess with Al.
Oh no, you're allowed to mess with me. I'm
just mess back.
Well, no, but what I do is I was talking to my wife about this, is that I need to not be a social worker when I go into meetings about my children. So I know the system. So I'm very meek and mild because that's what they want dads to be. If you're a dad who goes, I know my rights, then I'm that dad, aren't I? And I'm immediately framed a certain way. So I very much, yes sir, no sir. Because that's how the system works. I will, if I have to, I will, I'll defend my corner. But So I think that, and I think I do a lot of work with adoptive families, saying this is how you need to work with professionals. This is not, you are not complaining because your Argos order got messed up. These are social workers. You need to understand their mentality, how they work, and so supporting them in getting good outcomes. Communication, about communication.
Oh,
yeah,
communication is absolutely key.
It's all about communication.
MBE. I forgot to put MBE. Please forgive me, sir. Please forgive me.
Oh,
So
don't.
for those people who don't know what an MBE is, because we do have a few people watching from outside of the UK, what is an
God bless
MBE and how do
you have to sleep with a lot of people.
I-
No, yeah. I'm a dirty stop out. No, what an MBE is, you're a member of the Order of the British Empire, which is a terrible colonial thing, which is very complicated. And I grew up in a family that was fairly Republican, so we're not particularly enamored by that. But the reality is, it's a recognition of work that you've done in relation to a specific. An MBE, you get MBE, OBE, CBE. MBE is the bottom rung of the ladder. You're a member of the order, you're an officer of the order, and then you're a commander of the order, and then you're a knight of the order. So I did some work with. I worked at the Department for Education, and I did some work around supporting adopters, and I was part of an expert advisory group for 3 or 4 years, I think. And so it was kind of a bum for that, I think. I mean, it's services to children. To be honest, I really, really vexed over it because it rubs some people up the wrong way and it rubs other people up the right way. And a friend of mine said, don't believe a word of it and use it to open some doors. And so that's what we do. And my mother was like a dog with two tails. Honestly, we went to the Kingdom Palace, and I took some of my kids who wanted to go, and the one who came in, and she was only 6 at the time, and she went, oh, Dad, I really hope you don't get another one because that was so boring. And I said, you went and saw the flipping Queen in our house, and she so that was it was a wonderful day out, and it was
some people.
Yeah, that's true.
And lastly, and then I'll see if there's anything else you want to add to it. Talk to us a little bit about your podcast and how people can access them. I know I've put the link here. And Joe and I have kindly been invited by yourself to be on one of your podcasts. But what is the purpose of your podcast?
I think that I feel that there's not a lot of places where we can discuss tricky issues. And I think that, the issue, we talked about the dynamics of adoption and the challenging behavior. And there's issues around racism in adoption, issues around contact. All of the environments are kind of very ordered and structured and contained within people who are being paid by the service or the, a local authority or whatever. And the way it's set up. So and also I'm conscious that a lot of families, probably like a lot of families that you work with, they're incredibly isolated and at the wit's end. So we basically set it up to start with as somewhere to come and get access to people who are cleverer than us. So we really try and get lots of interesting people and who've got interesting perspectives. They might be doctors, in relation to child psychology, but we've had the odd, we have psychologists, we have people who are kind of run charities, different voices and fostering and adoption, and hopefully get, someone might write a book on autism and we'll say, oh, come on and give us a free book, and they'll do it for the attention, and we'll get 2 hours with them, which someone would have had to have paid to go and see them talk. So we then do that, but also where we can talk about things that we don't care what anyone says. So we're talking about contact, and then in September we're going to start talking about racism in adoption because we think that's a huge issue. And you just go on iTunes and you'll find us. We prattle on as well. I also felt it should be really important that it's like the Muppets, the two old men. So me and Scott, my co-host, we're exactly like that, and we just prattle on because we think that it's just somewhere to go. And I'll talk about the price of chips and what my daughter's up to. She buys she saves up and buys bizarre things like AstroTurf. What 8-year-old does that? So we talk about that sort of thing. And just make it a sort of a safe place, but also really importantly, we make it a place where people can tell their stories. So we get every other week we have someone who comes on and talks about adopted adults, which again probably the most hidden voice in the community. Tell your story. you know, and no filter. You just say what you want to say, so people will come on. And some people have said amazing, you know, told us amazing things about how they see it, and because it's got to be any service or any function has got to be led by the people who are, you know, I came to the adoption party willingly. If you're a birth parent and you're an adopted child, you didn't. This was done to you. So this, you know, they paint this picture of this lovely adoption triangle. You've probably seen it. You know, you grew in my heart, not in my tummy. All that stuff really upsets me no end. But also the fact that it's run by a system. So all of that stuff, you kind of go, we need places where we can talk about that so we can affect positive change. See, ask a question now, just keep going.
Well, it's obvious. It's obvious now why you've got this MBE, mate. You're one of these lovely individuals that when you see a problem or an issue, you think, well, what can I do about that? I wonder if this is done, or go and talk to the police, or do this podcast, or support parents where there is violence. And I think, you know, good on you. We need more like you. Well, that will get up and not just moan, but do something.
Yeah, I'm not a moaner. I'm a massive optimist. I think let's crack on. I set myself goals as well, and I think that actually consistency is the key one. So that's just keep going, plodding along, and every now and then you get a mountaintop.
Do that again. So I think Malika has asked, I'm currently supporting adopters and SGs with education. Podcasts sound great. How do I find it? So the podcast, Malika, is just where that scrolling screen is. But if you look up adoption and fostering .podbean or just type in podcast, it does come up.
Yeah, if you literally put the adoption and fostering podcast into any search engine.
Yeah, Al's face with another guy will come up there. But yeah, it's been absolutely amazing speaking with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Is there anything that we haven't asked that you would have liked us to have asked you?
That's a good question. No, if you set me off on another subject, there goes another hour.
Whatever.
I've got to have my tea, man.
Yeah.
I want to encourage everyone to look Al Coates up on Twitter. It's very interesting, and you'll be walking with him in the mornings, and he'll be telling you about the weather as soon as you open your eyes. And for some reason, I love kind of seeing those tweets. I get this little ping. Where's Al today? Has he managed to go out? Has he not managed to go out? It's very, very interesting. But amongst that, very, very educational what you put up, and your links with other professionals are outstanding. Really, really cool. So like Joe said, let's aim for the OBE now, Al. You're kind of
No. Honorary doctorate, that's what I'm really after, because I think then I could be Dr. Dad. I've tried to get the kids to call me Dr. Dad MBE, but not having any of it.
Maybe I'd take on here to Dr. Al Coates MBE.
Oh, that'd be so much fun, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Al. It's been.
Thank you for having me.
Hold on, just for.
Oh, hang on.
Oh, you're now Dr.
Oh.
Dr. Al Coates MBE.
Oh, I'm mortified. I shall breathe it in.
Thank you very much. Like Joe said, it's been amazing having you. And for everyone else, on Wednesday, we have Rachel Gillibrand joining us. Joe, quick, who's Rachel?
Rachel Gillibrand is... right. So Rachel uses hypnosis and solution focus together. She's very, very interesting. She's done research on what happens in the brain when you ask solution focused questions. She's got some amazing sort of data on that. And we met her in Bath 2 years ago, and it was really fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to that. But yeah, she's a solution-focused hypnotherapist, but among other things, that's not just her only title. She ain't got an OBE though, Al. Don't get jealous.
We've kind of put the bar up high now. We only want people voting.
Yeah. OBEs or above.
Yeah.
So Wednesday at 4 o'clock. Al, can I just want you to stay there for a couple of minutes, and everyone else, we will see you Wednesday.
Wednesday. Bye, everyone.